I am delighted to be with you today. My name is Reverend Naomi. You can call me Reverend Naomi. And I want to explore the theological nature of white supremacy for the next few minutes. I want to start by saying I became interested in this once I moved away from my hometown, my home church, my home social network, and experienced Christianity as other people were doing it. People who didn't grow up where I grew up, people who weren't formed how I was formed spiritually, religiously. And so it got me wondering, what's peculiar about the way I was exposed to Christianity? And what are some of the vulnerabilities within Christian tradition that allow Christianity to be used as an instrument of systems of oppression? Right? How is Christianity as a religious system, as an ideology, vulnerable to that kind of exploitation? So I started to ask those questions 20 years ago. Here I am, a professional Christian, a professional religious person, still exploring these same questions. And I think that today, here as we sit in January of 2020, this is a question that is top of mind as we negotiate our political climate, our social climate, and yes, our religious climate. Today, a day of significance even within the Catholic Church here in Philadelphia, right? You all know the buzz today about the appointment of a new archbishop for our area, right? So I think this is a really timely conversation 20 years after I first started, and believe you me, I'm not the only one or the first one to ask these questions, but 20 years after I started to explore it, here we sit, okay? So that gives you a frame of what we're going to talk about for the next chunk of time. I want you to react to this image. Can you see? I don't know if lights would be helpful. Oh, okay, that's pitch black, okay. Okay, well, on or off, these are options. What comes to mind when you look at this picture? Yeah.
Turning over in his grave if he's still in it.
Okay, so Jesus, are you suggesting, would be displeased with this picture? Okay. Other thoughts that come to mind? Have you ever seen this picture before? Okay, so it's a new picture. What's going on in the picture? Let's speculate. Yes.
As though Ku Klux Klan using racism, Jesus to, I don't even know, to justify how they act.
Okay, so we see some people we recognize by virtue of the fact that they have on what they have on. So these folks are dressed like Ku Klux Klan members. Okay, we see a banner that says Jesus saves. Where is this? Speculate.
The South.
Okay, you think in the South? Okay, why?
Oh, that's where the Ku Klux Klan was prominent.
Okay, so Klan activity may be prominent in the South, so we speculate that this was taken in the South. What else do we know about the location? Just speculation.
It looks like it's on the stage, kind of.
Okay. What kind of building might this be? A church. How do we know? This thing looks like a pulpit. We see somebody standing behind it who is dressed boringly, so I'm going to say that's the preacher. We might be inclined to see banners that say Jesus saves in a place where folk believe Jesus saves. So maybe a church. Other things you notice, yes.
Maybe I was like an auditorium or something like that.
Okay. Okay. So there's religious symbolism. There's also, this is some sort of stage, maybe. We got people seated. So maybe some sort of auditorium setting. Anything else? No. A lot of men. So it looks like there's not a lot of gender diversity here. Okay. Yeah. Looks like a flag. It is a flag. American flag in the corner here. There's another flag here. Not sure. Maybe state flag. I've been in some religious settings where there's a Christian flag. Okay. This was taken in Portland, Oregon, at a meeting hosted by a church of the Ku Klux Klan and an auxiliary association, an auxiliary organization. Does knowing that context change your reaction? How does that land on you? Knowing a little bit more about the origins of the picture.
Hurts.
It hurts? You want to say why?
The fact that I didn't know the Ku Klux Klan was, I didn't know it was in Oregon.
Mm-hmm. So geographically, that feels disorienting. Okay.
But it's so widespread.
Okay. Anything else striking about this? Yeah.
The fact they're allowed to be in an auditorium.
So.
Like in a public space with other people, like recognizing that they're there.
Uh-huh. So this isn't a private secret meeting in somebody's living room. Yes.
I think it surprised me also that the church organized it and was going to the church.
Okay. There seems to be some relationship between these two groups, these two institutions. The institution of the church and the institution of the Ku Klux Klan. Right? So the whole premise is that there is some sort of toxic, unhealthy, unrighteous relationship between an institution that we might call the poster institution for white supremacy and other kinds of social systems of oppression, and Christianity. Jesus saves who? Is a question that this image begs us to ask. What does that salvation consist of? Can I be saved? As far as these folks are concerned. Who is this minister and what was that conversation like? Did the minister do the inviting? Did the minister simply respond to a proposal for a meeting? Do they always have their meetings here? These are all questions I have as a result of seeing this image. But what it does, at least in my view, is, again, prompt me to ask, what of this relationship? How did these two get together? And again, what is the vulnerability within this statement, Jesus saves, that prompts some folk to think this is cool, this is appropriate, this is godly? Yeah. The Ku Klux Klan is a Christian organization, right? The burning of crosses is connected, right? So again, how did these folk get into it with each other, right? Okay. Any other comments on the picture before we move on? Yeah.
It's a little concerning too because I know we can't see the whole photo, but it looks like the whole crowd is full. Like they're trying to sing.
So this wasn't a sparsely attended meeting. People were not in protest staying home. People showed up and showed out, as we might say, at the meeting. Yeah. Good point. So here's the claim I'm making. That white supremacy and its cousins had to first be imagined and justified and implemented theologically in order to be sustained and effective politically, socially, economically, etc. That first it had to be sanctified. That first we had to make it part of God's design. before it could be successful. For this long. And still this effective, my argument. It had to first be theologically justified. What are your reactions to my making that claim? In order for it to work, it had to be put in God's hands literally. What do you think? Feel free to wrestle with me on it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like not necessarily God himself was like took that as the people who interpreted his words and like misused them, and it's their actions that like caused oppression and like obviously disastrous like things. But I don't necessarily think it was like God himself wanted that to happen.
Here's one of these vulnerabilities I'm referring to. That, take the Bible, the biblical witness is a witness. It is human beings trying to make sense of their own journeys. And in so doing, those human beings gave God a role. Gave God a nature. So in some ways, we imagine God to be fill in the blank. And that imagination is bound by our own limitations, our own commitments, sometimes misguided commitments. So if I've got commitment to women should never become ministers, that's my commitment, then I am going to look for a witness. You know, I grew up in a church tradition where the preacher was constantly asking, do I have a witness? Right. Meaning, do you know what I'm talking about? Have you seen it? Do I have a witness to this? Well, the biblical text and you and I, who come to the biblical text looking for spiritual formation, right, are trying to find a witness to our own experiences. You know, what does this got to do with me? And so, it's very then easy to come to the biblical text with my own commitments and invite God to my own commitment. So if I'm committed to the project of white supremacy, I'm committed to the project of Indigenous genocide, I'm committed to the project of patriarchy, I'm committed to the project of homophobia, transphobia, for whatever my reasons, I might come to a sacred text looking for a witness. I teach Theology 1000, which probably all of you have been tried by that fire, right? Okay. And we talk about biblical interpretation and the joys and challenges therein, right? So, theologically justifying a political system, an economic system, a social system that I'm already committed to. Okay, so more questions. I just have all the questions. I don't have many answers. Yes?
Can I just ask one question? At which point do you ask chicken and egg there? Because when you first started, I kind of heard you saying that there's something about Christianity that makes it vulnerable to this. So did people look at Scripture out of their own human fallibility to see a particular racial hierarchy reflected in the color language? I'm just wondering which came first there.
Yeah, so I think it's really messy. I think chickens and eggs in some way, you know. If we look back at Christian history, right, we know that at some point there was a deliberate fusion of church and state. That at some point, the person in charge of the state, hello, Constantine, decided this will be the religion of the state. Now, this is not a history class. This is not THL 1000, so I'm not going to get into why. He had his reason. But at some point, he did the fusing. So, chicken, I guess that would be. And yet the biblical text itself gives witness to the messiness between the Jesus movement, the folk who were trying to follow as best they could Jesus, and the other folk who saw this as an opportunity, the hope as an opportunity to exploit and to control. Right? So that's the non-answer to your question. I think that we got chickens and eggs at one time happening. And so vigilance, I think, is key. We'll come there in a second. Okay, here are more questions. What does racial identity have to do with theology? In other words, how does my racial identity or formation, racialization, impact how I do theology, what I say and think about God? How has God been used as a tool of white supremacy? So again, if you can put those words in God's mouth, those words become sanctified. We might not question them. How is white supremacy designed by a theology? I'm calling this a theology of whiteness. So when you put whiteness, which I'll define in a second, with theology, you get potentially the project of white supremacy. How have the ideals of white supremacy been woven into religious systems, symbols, ideas, and practices? So what we think is purely religious might also be connected to this ideological system over here. This is the hopeful question, the ambitious question. How can God be rescued from the clutches of white supremacy and its cousins? Right? Yeah.
You mean God and Christianity? Or just...
Well, my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm. You're saying another system.
The institution has been taken in some ways. And so let's first think about how do we restore a connection to and a commitment in the divine. And then we figure out how we're going to be in relationship to these institutions. So these are some questions that I think are worth considering. Defining some terms. This might be too small to read. I'm sorry about that. So whiteness. This I'm drawing from kind of contemporary wisdom around these concepts. The white race was invented. We can pinpoint the moment at which the white race came into being. It was invented as a ruling class that was formed to ensure social control. This process conferred certain privileges on European working people. It's important to note that these privileges were not only against the interests of non-white people, but they were detrimental to the class interests of working people. So this sinister way in which there was a conferral of privilege while at the same time a pulling out of the economic rug, right? So white supremacy is the ideology that centers around the belief that white people are superior in certain characteristics, traits, attributes, as compared to people of other racial backgrounds. It's also a political ideology that maintains the political domination of white people. And it's a system of structural racism that privileges white people over others, regardless of the presence or absence of hatred. right? Usually we think about the Klan, you know, folk just have animus toward all these people, right? Yeah, that, and there need not be hatred. There need not be people.
Right.
There's a book called Racism Without Racists that, if you're interested in, you should pick up. Scholar says we don't need racists to maintain a system that confers privileges and maintains a system of domination. Racism, many folk define as both racial prejudice and abuse or misuse of power, right? That prejudice isn't enough. You also got to have the corresponding power. These are just, so we know we're not just throwing around terms, we kind of define them. Mentor, Professor, Reverend Dr. James Cone. I hope he's resting well. He wrote this: one must suppose that in order to feel comfortable in the Christian faith, whites needed theologians to interpret the gospel in a way that would not require them to acknowledge white supremacy as America's greatest sin. Right? So again, this brings back into the picture this question of what agency do I have to interpret the text, bless you, in a way that furthers my own commitments or helps me dodge the things I'm afraid to name. James Cone is often called the father of black theology. He just died a couple years ago. Now this guy is Reverend Dr. William Jones. He was Cone's contemporary. They were writing and thinking at the same time. But Jones has some bones to pick with Cone. Cone was saying, I know that God is on the side of the oppressed. God wants to restore dignity to those who've been dispossessed, dismissed, discarded. Jones was like, what reality are you looking at? Because it doesn't seem to me that the dispossessed and the discarded and the dismissed are winning. It doesn't seem to me that God is on their side. If God is just and benevolent, meaning God is interested in justice for all people, and God is good, and on the side of the oppressed, then what accounts for the persistence of black people's pain and suffering and death? So William Jones was like, your God must be a white racist. He wrote a book called Is God a White Racist? To provoke the conversation. He ultimately came down on, no, God is not a white racist. But he asked the question because he said, this doesn't add up to me. The experience of black folk in particular seems to suggest that God is actually interested in furthering the project of white supremacy and not in restoring dignity and health and well-being to those who are most vulnerable. So he was pushing Cone. What do you think of this conversation? So Cone, God is on the side of the oppressed. White theologians, y'all need to get it together. How can you be ignoring what's actually happening around you? How can you ignore the fact that many white folks went to church Sunday morning and didn't even go home to change out the church clothes? Went to the park and passed hot dogs and witnessed and celebrated a lynching. How, Cone, can you say God is on the side of those folks being lynched when the God folk are the ones who have this as the kind of after church meal? Right? I mean, it was that raw for them. This was the time in which they were writing and thinking. Right? What do you think about this conversation? Y'all with me? Y'all all right? Yes.
I feel like it's like definitely needed,
Okay.
and that's still like just how important that question was then. It's just important now.
Okay. What are the ways in which we see atrocities cloaked in God language? What are the ways in which we see religious communities engaging in violence, ideological violence and physical violence, and saying it's because God told me to, because the Bible says so? Yeah.
Like for intermarriage, things people would say it's against God's will. Whatever.
Yes. Right? I've heard arguments against immigration, the radical hospitality toward those who are coming seeking refuge, seeking home, on theological grounds that Jesus would be opposed to. I mean, all kinds of constructions of theological arguments that then back up a particular political position. And let me just say here, to be honest about where I am, I'm not suggesting that the gospel is not political. So I'm just going to tell you my own. I'm not suggesting that. These questions require us to ask, okay, so what kind of politics can be justified by the gospel? Right? So let's do some examples here. We have some theological claims we make about the body. Any number of things. How might those claims be connected to the values of white supremacy? We have claims about the connection between material provision and spiritual provision. I grew up in a religious environment where if you did not experience wealth, or you on your way to wealth, then that was a sign of low faith. That God blesses those who are faithful. Blesses them how? With wealth. Notions of purity and piety, right? There's a certain way there's pureness to this and darkness and sinfulness associated with that. Sorry about that. We talk about biblical interpretations, right? As vulnerable to the system of white supremacy. The minute somebody could find the institution of slavery in the biblical text, there you go. Let me read this text to you as I escort you to the place where I will keep you enslaved for the rest of your life. The religious imagination. This is really key. I like to do this stuff with kids too. Ask them to draw a picture of God. And I just give them time. You know, all of the Crayola 64 crayons. And we talk about, so how did God get to be that way in your imagination? You know? Philosophical commitments, manifest destiny as another historical marker, right? The idea, God has given us this land. And who can argue with that? No, God didn't. Well, original sin, I was talking to somebody earlier about believing that humanity is fundamentally and innately fallen. What does that mean about redemption and whether redemption is possible? And how hard we work to give people another chance, or not, if they're fundamentally. This seems small, but language is never small. References to light and dark. What does it mean in our imagination if we always associate darkness with evil? Subconsciously. I mean, subconsciously. So that when I see you, and I got a split second to evaluate, I'm inclined to associate that darkness with ill intent. Where does that come from? And how might we talk about darkness as loaded with other kinds of possibility? That's why I love Advent. It's supposed to be this really dark, dank time before Christmas. Some plants only grow in the dark.
Some fish on me.
Huh. Come on. Just those small reframes. These ideas have consequences. That's all I'm saying. These theological ideas have consequences. I referenced this already. What do we do about those passages? Do we pretend they're not there? Do we admit that they've been used against folks as weapons? Do we acknowledge that the institution of slavery is present in the biblical text? What do we do about that? What does it mean if Jesus' world included enslavement? What does that mean about the radicality of Jesus saying, I have come to set the captives free? Good old Job. Y'all know Job? Job living his life, minding his business. And then all hell breaks loose, right? One thing at a time. Which in some ways, that's like torture. He loses his children, and he loses his livelihood, his crops, and his animals. Right? He loses his health. His body is covered in sores. And then his wife is like, look, dude, I don't know. What's going on here? And his friends at first are sitting with him and like, we got you, Job. And then at some point they're like, so man, what did you do to deserve this? Job, facing a life of misfortune. I'm teaching a class this semester on suffering and how we might make theological meaning of suffering or not. And the primary question we're asking is, how is some suffering responded to differently by religious folks than other suffering? And how might those responses be informed by ideas around race and class and gender? Really sad story the other day. A woman reported to the ER, a black woman, young, maybe 20 years old, was having chest pains. She was really sick. She sat in the ER for like 6 hours, and they kept telling her, we'll come back to you, we'll get back to you, we'll come back to you. She decides she can't wait anymore, and she leaves and tries to go to like urgent care. She gets to urgent care and she dies. People are like, what? She was feet away from the things that could have saved her. What accounts for that kind of delay? Not just in an individual's experience, but in a community's experience, in a collective experience. And how do we assign God a role in all of that? That's really where I'm going. Galatians 5, in Christ there is no Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, nor bond nor free, right? It's really great. I mean, really great, right? Well, there's some scholars and theologians, particularly scholars and theologians of color, who want to say, don't erase the fact that I'm black, that I'm a woman, that I'm short. I don't know. Don't erase the particularities of my identity. God made me this way. With the kink in my hair. Right? Yes.
I think we've used Galatians 5, I mean, colorblind is a great word, to say that, yeah, there is none of this.
Right.
And instead, we've misinterpreted this. We all have access to this. We've taken out that. We all have access to the kingdom. Not that there isn't those general differences in the kingdom, but that we all have access. And so I think we've built up a theology and we've built up a relationship using Galatians 5 to wipe away what is culturally significant to each other instead of talking about what really Christ provided with us, which is access.
Yeah. That Christ is not showing any favorites, playing any favorites here. That all can come and find rest and redemption and hope and love and justice. Oh, there's more. Recognize this? Classic, right? We know this. Beloved, right? The black Latina woman, Harmonia Rosales, who created this, got death threats, y'all. Death threats. Not because this was in a museum, not because, this was on Instagram. I don't know how you Instagram it, but I don't expect to get death threats as a result of my Instagram posts. What's different here? Okay, we got women, yes. You gotta say women. Black women, dark-skinned.
There you go. Which is critical.
Uh-huh.
Right.
1 or 2. 1 or 2. Nobody's ever been to the eye doctor. That's fine. Okay. So, you...
Even the little kids are like all girls too.
Okay.
The title is also different.
The creation of Adam, the creation of God. This was deeply offensive to some folk. There's some commitments to God as male, to God as white, to God as fill in the blank. This is a hand. Okay?
Right.
Classic. I mean, this was in my grandmother's kitchen.
Every home.
Absolutely.
Every home.
Warner Salmons, head of Christ. When he drew this, he did not know that it would become this. What do we know about Jesus here? Jesus white. Jesus is handsome, you know.
Looking guy.
Kind of a beefcake Jesus, I don't know.
Embodies the oppressed people.
Okay, the representation of Jesus here, for many, connects to the representation of the one who is currently oppressing me. This looks like power. This looks like access. This looks like... Can you see? Hope you can see. Okay. Now, you know, I put the title and stuff there, but if I didn't put that, what do you notice here?
There's a little plant growing.
There's a, okay. And it stands out because it's the vibrant color. I mean, everything else is kind of dreary and kind of grayed out, sort of. We got this and the star. There's so many biblical references embedded. I hope you Google this and look at it closely. We got Jose with a name tag here, like a mechanic's kind of shirt. And we've got this young girl here who has a hoodie on that says Nazareth High School. She is pregnant. What else? Dave's City Motel, the city of David. You will find, right. The Wise Men cigarettes. Sort of looks like a halo around the girl's head, sort of. The star on the sign, yeah. No vacancy at this hotel. No room in the inn. This is supposed to say manger with the... This says good news, like Good News candy bar. There's an ad here in this newspaper on the ground that says glad tidings. So lots of stuff buried in here that Patterson buried. So he drew this. He's a cartoonist, illustrator. Drew this, sent it out as his Christmas card in 2014. Guess who got death threats? Why? How does this offend certain commitments? If this is Joseph and Mary, what then? We got 2 kids trying to find shelter in the rain. Reference to kind of a working class background. Named Jose and Maria. That offends some sensibilities people might have about the origins of Jesus. Iconography is important in some religious communities, some Christian communities. This was created by Mark Dukes shortly after the death of, Michael Brown. What do you see? Okay, this reminds us of, okay, maybe Holy Mother, who is with child. But what do we know about this child based on this image?
Black man.
This child is going to be targeted. How does that frame Jesus in a way that offends certain commitments? That Jesus from the beginning, based upon the way he was living and what he was saying, was ultimately targeted and killed. The hands up, remember the hands up, don't shoot mantra. So an act of protest, an act of surrender, an act of fear, all of that. The priest who posted this on Facebook, so Mark Dukes didn't, but the priest did, got cussed out, told off. Sacrilegious, blasphemy. What do we see here? This is a reference to what biblical story?
He turned over the tables.
So Jesus encounters shady dealings going on in the temple. Not just kind of money changers objectively, but money changers who were exploiting financially the folks who were coming to them to do the exchange. So this was like, no. And Jesus drives them out. My house is a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves. What's changed, though, in this scenario? Who's been driven out? Can you all see the names? Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Chase, Citi. So a reference to the institution, the financial sector's exploitation of folks who cannot possibly pay back that payday loan, or cannot possibly get over their heads above water on their mortgage, or whatever it is. Cone, his next to last book before he died, was called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He wanted to draw a connection between the lynching tree as an instrument, an apparatus for public execution, public humiliation, shame, and the cross that Jesus carried and died on. The cross as an instrument, an apparatus of public execution, of public shaming and humiliation. Dying a humiliating, painful death. One who had not committed a crime. And in Cone's work, he's saying, how come all of those white theologians didn't make the connection between the cross that they preached and the lynchings that were going on right in their communities? Y'all all right?
Yeah, I forgot my chat. Sorry.
Couple more. What's here? This is a reference to Last Supper. This is called the First Supper. Why? Why do you think? First Peoples. This woman here represents, I should say, Susan White is an Australian Indigenous artist. And so who sits where Jesus sat in the famous depiction of the Last Supper? An Indigenous woman. An Indigenous woman. And everybody else at the table is a woman. Notice anything? Anything stick out to you? Yes.
It's people from all different ethnicities.
Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm. I'm honing in here. So she's got on denim overalls. She's pale skinned. She's drinking like Coca-Cola. And she's sitting where in the beloved, famous depiction, Judas sat. Mm-hmm. So what is this? I mean, she's given us some commentary about the betrayer. Not necessarily this woman here, but what she represents. Right? Commercialization, colonization.
Maybe a commentary on the feminist movement versus women of color.
So that even the women, we're celebrating 100 years of the suffragist movement this year, 2020. There was a critique coming from women who had been left out of the movement, who said these goals are not connected to my goals. These goals lack a certain kind of analysis that you only get from people like me, if you include me. Okay? Last picture. The author is anonymous, but people have given it the title Crucifixation. Why? Okay, so we got people taking pictures. Might be a commentary about, I went to the movies the other day, and there was a domestic situation happening. Right there in the parking lot. People standing around filming.
Mm.
On the one hand, sometimes video helps. On the other hand, eek. Please, if you all see something going down with me out here, please come help me. You know my name. Come, please. So we have the picture taking on the one hand, and then we have what's going on here.
Torture and keeping the press out.
Okay, so both and. So this person might be contributing to the harm, violence. This person might be protecting or holding back the crowd, or I don't know. But this is an obvious reference to Jesus carrying the cross.
Mm-hmm.
I'm watching the time. I've got the next few slides are biblical passages that I invite us to read in a way that rejects interpretations that are connected to white supremacy. So let's do just one, maybe. I know you can't read this. This is the story of Abraham and Isaac. God says to Abraham, take your son, Isaac, go to Mount Moriah. Good to see you. And offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Abraham and Isaac journey up Mount Moriah. Isaac at some point on the journey says, where's the lamb? I don't know. Daddy? Abraham says, God will provide. It'll be fine. They walk on together. They come to the place. Abraham picks up Isaac, lays him on the altar, took the knife, stopped by voice, Abraham, Abraham, don't hurt the boy. Abraham looks up. Over there is a ram in the bush. Abraham gets the ram, sacrifices it instead, names the place, the Lord will provide. Okay. So I want to know, how might interpretations of this text be used? How is this text vulnerable to being exploited by the goals of white supremacy? So I'm asking you to, for a second, suspend the thing that you've been taught about this text. I mean, I was taught, Abraham, the father of our faith, because he didn't withhold his precious, precious child from God. So I'm asking you to suspend and answer this question. How might this text be vulnerable to being used as a tool of white supremacy? Yes.
Maybe someone would view it as, don't sacrifice one of your own, one that, is like you. Instead, use one, sacrifice one that's, you view as inferior or as different to you.
That some sacrifices are justifiable.
Right.
Some acts of violence are God ordained. One of the things I like, go ahead.
I was going to say, my consciousness goes to the thread of conversation around mass incarceration and the drug epidemic, which had one path about protection for specific groups, which now is calling for empathy and understanding for the opioid epidemic.
Sure.
because there's a different group
Sure.
that's being protected.
Sure. Some suffering is worth our sympathy and concern and compassion and intervention. Some suffering, well, that is a test of your faith. That is your lot in life. One of the things I like to say when I talk about this text is that we don't see, after this moment, any interaction in the biblical text between Abraham and Isaac. Now that might be the just didn't come up or whatever, but I would you be the same? Coming down the mountain after you've just had this encounter? What do you say? What do you talk about? The next time we see them in the same sentence in the biblical text is because Abraham has died and Isaac has come home to bury his father. Just saying. My favorite stories in the Bible. Mark 5. Jesus comes to the country of the Gerasenes. And a man who was living in the tombs. Stop. You're looking for a place to live after college. You will not go to the nearest cemetery. So I want to know, how did this man get to live in the tombs? Who put him there? Who drove him there? He is living among the dead. He has an unclean spirit. Many folks, particularly those in the disability justice movement, make a claim here about the extent to which this man was misunderstood or vilified because of his mental illness. He has an unclean spirit. He's living in the tombs. No one could restrain him, even with a chain. He'd often been restrained, but the chains he wrenched apart. Night and day, he lived among the tombs, and he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. He's hurting himself. He saw Jesus coming, ran to Jesus and said, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Stop. So the folk, you mean to tell me that the folk who are living in among the dead, living in those places where we don't want to go, who have something going on that folk don't understand, who hurt themselves, who might be a danger to others, recognize Jesus? Call Jesus by name? What? I adjure you by God, don't torment me. Jesus had said, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Jesus asks the man, "What's your name?" The man replies, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Stop. That's an odd way to answer that question. That's like saying, "My name is 13.
Right.
What does that mean? What would that have meant to the people who heard it? Legion was a unit of Roman soldiers. I am the military. I'm just going to hang that right there. He begged, the man begged Jesus not to send the spirits out of the country. So Jesus sends the unclean spirits into a herd of swine that they over there minding their business, and then they get overtaken by the unclean spirits. The pigs, 2,000 of them, imagine this scene, 2,000 of them jump into the sea and drown. The people who saw that say they're afraid. This man now is clothed and in his right mind. So they told Jesus, "Leave." As Jesus was leaving, the man who had been possessed said, "Can I come with you?" And Jesus said, No. Go tell everybody what happened. lots of commentary we could make here about people living in incarceration, people living in isolation from community, people living with mental illness that people criminalize or demonize, and the response of a community when that person gets it together.
Right.
The text says he was clothed and in his right mind, and the people were angry and afraid.
Right.
And told Jesus, you better get out of here, dude. The pigs, this is the last thing I'll say, were the source of income and the livelihoods of the folks living in that region. So how dare Jesus come in here and heal this man and have it cost us something? I'm not preaching.
Right. Yes. And poverty is big business.
Well, all I want to say, y'all, is be vigilant about rescuing the God of your understanding from the clutches of systems of oppression. Watch out for the use of your religious symbols and your stories to hurt and oppress other folk. That's all I wanted to say. All right.
Thank you.
See you later.